when single father Daniel Hayes screamed, "Don't eat that dessert!" across an upscale restaurant, freezing CEO Victoria Lane mid-bite. He had no idea he was about to save her life and completely destroy his own. What happened next would tear apart everything they thought they knew about power class and the thin line between survival and love. One poisoned spoon, two shattered worlds, a Ferrari that would change everything. Stay with me until the very end of this incredible true story and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this amazing tale has traveled across the world. The fluorescent lights of Sterling and Associates' corporate tower buzzed with an electric tension. At 11:47 p.m., their harsh glare casting knife-sharp shadows across marble floors that gleamed like ice. Daniel Hayes dragged his mop across the polished surface, each stroke echoing through the empty corridors, like a heartbeat, steady, rhythmic, and completely unaware that this would be his last normal night on Earth. At 32, Daniel had perfected the art of invisibility. His weathered hands gripped the mop handle with the practiced efficiency of a man who understood that survival meant being seen but never noticed, heard but never remembered. His gray maintenance uniform, pressed despite its age, worn despite its dignity, carried the faint scent of industrial cleaner and desperation that only other working parents would recognize. "Daddy will be home soon, baby girl," he whispered to the creased photograph tucked behind his ID badge. 8-year-old Emma smiled back at him, from the worn edges her gap-toothed grin and wild curls a perfect mirror of the joy that had died with his wife Sarah 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days ago. But who was counting? The elevator dinged softly in the distance, an unusual sound that made Daniel's stomach clench with inexplicable dread. Something was wrong. In 3 years of night shifts, he'd learned to read this building like a book, and tonight felt different. Dangerous. The very air seemed to vibrate with the kind of tension that comes before lightning strikes. Unknown to Daniel, 23 floors above his methodical cleaning, Victoria Lane stood at floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected not just her image but the target painted invisibly on her back. At 29, she commanded Sterling and Associates with the ruthless precision of a general who'd won every battle but was slowly losing the war. Her reflection showed a woman who'd mastered the art of armor designer suits that fit like battle gear, perfectly styled auburn hair that never dared betray weakness, and green eyes that could freeze a boardroom with a single glance. But tonight, those same eyes betrayed something else: fear. The threatening note had arrived that morning, slipped between quarterly reports like a snake in silk sheets. Some acquisitions come with a price. Pay it or we'll collect another way. A concerned investor. Victoria's manicured fingers trembled almost imperceptibly as she touched the glass. 3 companies had tried to acquire Sterling and Associates in the past 6 months. 3 rejections had been delivered with the kind of corporate politeness that barely concealed warfare. And now someone was playing a different game entirely. "Ms. Lane." Her assistant Jennifer's voice crackled through the intercom like a lifeline. "Your dinner reservation tomorrow night. Should I confirm the security detail?" Victoria's reflection showed her grimace. Even Jennifer was scared now. "No. If I let them intimidate me into hiding, they've already won." "But ma'am, after the note this morning," I said no, and the words came out sharper than intended, cutting through the air like broken glass. Victoria softened her tone, but the steel remained. "Go home to your family, Jennifer. Some of us still can." The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken fears and the weight of decisions that could mean life or death. In the depths of the building, Daniel worked with the methodical precision of a man whose world depended on routine. But tonight, routine felt like walking a tightrope over an abyss. The letter hidden in his locker seemed to burn through the metal, an eviction notice disguised as a friendly reminder that rent was increasing by 40% next month. 40%. The numbers might as well have been written in blood. He'd run the calculations 17 times during his dinner break, the same dinner Emma had packed for him, with a note that read, "You're the best daddy ever," in her careful second-grade handwriting. Each calculation led to the same terrifying conclusion. Even working 3 jobs, he couldn't make it work. Daniel pulled out his phone with hands that shook more than they should, scrolling through banking apps that showed numbers stark and unforgiving in blue digital light. Rent, utilities, groceries, Mrs. Patterson's babysitting fee, Emma's after-school program, her too small winter coat, the car payment on a Honda that wheezed but still ran barely. The math was simple and brutal. He was drowning, and the water was rising fast. But it was the conversation he'd overheard earlier that really terrified him. 2 executives in expensive suits talking about optimization and redundancy reduction and cutting the fat from maintenance staff. They'd walked past him like he was furniture, never imagining that the man with the mop might understand exactly what they meant. His job, this lifeline, this steady paycheck with health insurance that kept Emma safe, could disappear with a single memo. Meanwhile, Victoria stared at her reflection and saw not a successful CEO, but a woman who'd built her empire on a foundation that someone was now trying to blow up. The hostile Koamal takeover attempts were escalating. Marcus Rothwell, her former business partner turned bitter rival, had been circling like a shark for months. But the note suggested something darker, not just corporate warfare, but personal vengeance. She thought about the file locked in her safe, the one marked Rothwell evidence that contained proof of his illegal practices during their partnership, proof that could destroy him if it ever went public. Marcus knew she had it just like she knew he'd do anything to keep it buried. Her phone buzzed a text from an unknown number. "Beautiful view from the 23rd floor. Sleep well, Victoria." The blood in her veins turned to ice water. Someone was watching. Someone knew exactly where she was, exactly when she was vulnerable. Victoria moved away from the windows, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. This wasn't just business anymore. This was personal. 2 floors below, Daniel had worked his way into the conference room where Sterling and Associates board meetings took place. The mahogany table gleamed under recessed lighting surrounded by leather chairs that cost more than his annual salary. But tonight, the room felt different, charged with an energy that made his skin crawl. Papers were scattered across the table, and despite his strict rule about not reading confidential documents, and one memo caught his eye like a neon sign, "Project Elimination, Phase 1 complete. Target acquired for final resolution." Daniel's blood turned to slush. He'd seen enough crime shows with Emma to recognize the language of violence when it was dressed up in corporate speak. Someone in this building, someone who sat in these expensive chairs and made life-or-death decisions, was planning something terrible. His hands trembled as he cleaned around the documents, his mind racing. Should he call someone who would believe a janitor who claimed to have stumbled across evidence of what murder corporate espionage? His word against theirs would be like tissue paper against a hurricane. But the image of Emma sleeping peacefully in their tiny apartment, trusting him to keep their world safe, gave him courage he didn't know he possessed. Whatever was happening here, whatever darkness was brewing in these marble halls, he couldn't just look the other way. As midnight approached, Victoria found herself doing something she'd never done before, walking the halls of her own building like a prisoner in a cage. Her heels clicked against marble floors, with an echo that seemed to announce her presence to anyone listening. She'd spent years in these walls, but always moving with purpose, always protected by schedules and security and the illusion of control. Tonight, she felt hunted. The building seemed to watch her with 1,000 hidden eyes, every shadow potentially concealing a threat. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like warning sirens, and even the familiar scent of floor cleaner smelled different. Sharper, more chemical, more dangerous. On the 18th floor, she heard the soft sound of someone working and followed it like a moth to flame. Anything was better than the suffocating isolation of her office and the growing certainty that tomorrow night's dinner reservation might be her last. She discovered one of the maintenance crew, a man about her age, methodically mopping with the kind of focused attention that spoke of more than just professional pride. There was something almost meditative about his movements, a peace that Victoria envied with startling intensity. But when he looked up and saw her, his eyes held something that made her breath catch recognition. Not of her face, but of her fear. This man understood what it meant to be trapped, to be hunted by circumstances beyond your control. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Daniel said quickly, moving to push his cart aside. His voice carried the careful politeness of someone who'd learned that survival meant making himself smaller. "I didn't realize anyone was still here. I can come back later." "No, please." Victoria's voice came out softer than she'd intended, almost vulnerable. "Don't let me interrupt. I couldn't sleep." They stood there in the fluorescent-lit silence, two people from different worlds suddenly seeing each other clearly. Daniel noticed how her perfect composure was held together by sheer willpower, the way her hands trembled almost imperceptibly, and the fear she was trying so hard to hide. Victoria noticed the way he carried himself with quiet dignity, despite circumstances that would have broken lesser men, and the protective alertness in his eyes that reminded her of a guardian. "It's very clean," Victoria said, finally gesturing around them. "You take real pride in your work." Daniel's surprise was genuine. "Thank you, ma'am. This job means everything to me." There was something in the way he said everything that hit Victoria like a physical blow, as if this minimum wage job mopping floors was the difference between survival and catastrophe. "Do you have family?" The question escaped before she could stop it, more personal than any conversation she'd had in months. Daniel's entire face transformed when he smiled, exhaustion and worry falling away like a mask. "A daughter, Emma. She's 8 years old and thinks I hung the moon." 8. Victoria felt her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. She must be proud to have such a devoted father. Something flickered across Daniel's expression. Fierce love mixed with terror, devotion, tempered by the constant fear of not being enough. "I'd do anything for her. Anything." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning that neither fully understood. Victoria found herself wanting to know more about this man who spoke of love with such fierce certainty, who found purpose in protecting someone small and innocent in a world that seemed designed to crush the vulnerable. But before she could ask another question, Daniel's expression changed. His eyes focused on something over her shoulder, and the color drained from his face like water from a broken dam. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice tight with controlled panic. "I think you should see this." Victoria turned to follow his gaze, and her blood turned to ice. There, reflected in the dark window behind them, was the unmistakable silhouette of a figure watching from the building across the street, a figure that disappeared the instant they noticed it, melting into shadows like smoke. "How long have you been working this floor tonight?" Victoria asked, her CEO instincts kicking in despite her fear. "Since 11. "But ma'am," Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper, "I've been seeing things, hearing things, and I found something in the conference room that I think you need to know about." The building around them seemed to hold its breath, as if even the walls knew that this moment was a turning point. Two strangers thrown together by circumstance and fear were about to discover that their separate worlds were connected by threads of danger neither could have imagined. Victoria's phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. How sweet. Making friends with the help. Don't get too attached. Some people are easier to replace than others. The message was accompanied by a photo that made Victoria's knees nearly buckle. Emma Hayes, 8 years old, with wild curls and a gap-toothed grin walking out of her elementary school that very afternoon. Daniel saw the blood drain from Victoria's face and stepped closer, his protective instincts overriding every rule about maintaining professional distance. "Ma'am, what is it?" Victoria's hands shook as she showed him the phone. When Daniel saw his daughter's photo in the text thread, the careful politeness fell away completely, replaced by something primal and dangerous. "They're threatening Emma," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of controlled rage that could move mountains or burn them down. "Whoever's after you, they're using my little girl as leverage." Victoria stared at this man, this janitor she'd barely noticed for 3 years, and suddenly understood that their fates had become intertwined in ways neither could have predicted. The corporate conspiracy threatening her empire and the financial desperation threatening his family were pieces of the same deadly puzzle. "Mr. Hayes, Daniel Hayes. Mr. Hayes, I think we need to talk. Because whoever's doing this, they've just made the biggest mistake of their lives." Victoria's green eyes blazed with the kind of fury that had built empires and destroyed enemies. "They threatened a child. My child now, too." The building settled around them with a sound like a held breath finally being released. In the space of 5 minutes, a CEO and a janitor had become allies in a war neither had seen coming. Tomorrow night, when Victoria sat down to dinner at Le Bernardin, Danielle would be watching from the shadows. And when someone tried to poison her dessert, he'd be ready to risk everything, his job, his safety, his life to save a woman who'd just become the most important thing standing between his daughter and danger. But tonight, they were just two frightened people in an empty building holding a phone that proved their enemies were closer than they'd ever imagined, and that the real battle was just beginning. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a countdown timer, marking the final hours before their ordinary lives would explode into extraordinary circumstances, and nothing would ever be the same again. The photograph of Emma on Victoria's phone screen burned itself into Daniel's retinas like a brand. His daughter's innocent smile, captured by a stranger with malicious intent, transformed him from a careful, invisible janitor into something far more dangerous. The protective fury that erupted in his chest was the kind that could drive a man to extraordinary acts or extraordinary mistakes. "When was this taken?" His voice had dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. Victoria studied the metadata with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to analyzing threats. "Today, 3:47 p.m. right after school dismissal." Daniel's jaw clenched so hard Victoria could hear his teeth grinding. "Mrs. Patterson picks her up at 3:45. Every day. Same routine, same corner." His hands curled into fists that had never thrown a punch, but looked ready to learn. "They've been watching us, learning our patterns." "Mr. Hayes," Victoria's voice cut through his rage like ice water, "whoever's doing this isn't playing games. If they're willing to photograph a child, they're willing to do much worse." The words hung between them like a death sentence. Daniel's mind raced through every crime documentary he'd ever watched with Emma, every news story about children who'd disappeared, every parent's worst nightmare made flesh. But beneath the terror, something else was building, a cold, calculating anger that reminded Victoria uncomfortably of herself in a hostile boardroom. "You said you found something in the conference room. she said, forcing her CEO instincts to override her panic. "Show me." They moved through the building like conspirators, their footsteps echoing in harmony against marble floors that suddenly felt more like a trap than a workplace. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with an ominous buzz, and every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. In the conference room, Daniel pointed to the scattered papers with hands that barely trembled. "I wasn't trying to read them, I swear, but this one—" Victoria's face went white as bone as she read the memo. "Project elimination. Phase 1 complete. Target acquired for final resolution." Her hands shook as she flipped through the other documents. "These aren't from my company. Someone planted these here." "What's Phase 1? Daniel asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know the answer. "Surveillance, pattern recognition, vulnerability assessment." Victoria's voice was clinical, detached, as if discussing someone else's potential murder could somehow make it less real. "They've been studying me for weeks. My routines, my relationships, my weaknesses. And Emma—" Victoria's composure cracked like ice under pressure. "Your daughter isn't a weakness, Mr. Hayes. She's leverage. They know that threatening her is the fastest way to control you." "Control me how?" Before Victoria could answer, her phone buzzed again. This time the message was longer, more detailed, and infinitely more terrifying. "Tomorrow night, Le Bernardin, 8 p.m. Ms. Lane will order the chocolate soufflé for dessert. A special ingredient has been added to ensure she enjoys her last meal. Any attempt to involve police, change venues, or bring security will result in immediate consequences for the Hayes family. The janitor will watch. The janitor will do nothing. The janitor will learn what happens to people who interfere with business." Daniel read over her shoulder, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. "They know about tomorrow night's dinner. They know about the dessert. They know everything." "More than that," Victoria said, her voice barely audible. "They know you'll be there. They're counting on you seeing it happen and being too terrified to act." The realization hit them both like a physical blow. This wasn't just about corporate warfare or hostile takeovers. This was about psychological torture, forcing a father to watch a murder while his child's life hung in the balance, turning a good man into an unwilling accomplice through pure terror. "We have to call the police," Daniel said, reaching for his phone. "No." Victoria's hand shot out to stop him, her grip surprisingly strong. "If we involve law enforcement, they'll follow through on their threat. And Emma—" The words died in her throat, but they both understood. A child's life had become the ultimate bargaining chip in a game neither of them fully understood. "Then what do we do?" Daniel's voice cracked with the strain of a man pushed beyond his limits. Victoria stared at the conference room table, where she'd negotiated billion-dollar deals, made decisions that affected thousands of lives, built an empire from nothing but determination and ruthless intelligence. Now faced with the most important decision of her life, she felt smaller than she ever had before. "We beat them at their own game," she said finally. "But first, we need to understand who we're fighting." They spent the next hour in Victoria's office, surrounded by the trappings of success that now felt more like museum pieces than achievements. Victoria pulled files from her safe while Daniel paced like a caged animal, his mind constantly drifting to Emma, sleeping peacefully in their apartment, unaware that her life had become a chess piece in someone else's deadly game. "Marcus Rothwell," Victoria said, spreading photographs and documents across her desk. "My former business partner, current nemesis, and the most likely candidate for wanting me dead." Daniel studied the photos, a man in his 40s with silver hair and cold eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they looked at, including human lives. "What did you do to him?" I refused to let him destroy this company with his illegal practices. When I found evidence of his money laundering operation, I gave him a choice: resign quietly or face federal charges. Victoria's voice hardened with remembered anger. He chose option 3, attempt to destroy me personally and professionally. Oh, the evidence you mentioned, you still have it. Victoria nodded toward her safe. Enough to put him away for 20 years. But if I'm dead, it dies with me. And if I use it to destroy him, he'll retaliate against Emma. Daniel finished the thought, his stomach churning with the implications. They sat in silence, the weight of their impossible situation pressing down like a physical force. Outside the windows, the city sparkled with lights from thousands of lives being lived in blissful ignorance of the deadly drama unfolding 23 floors above the street. "There's something else," Victoria said quietly. "Something I haven't told you." Daniel looked up from the photographs, dread pooling in his stomach like acid. 6 months ago, Marcus made me an offer. He wanted to buy Sterling and Associates for a fraction of its worth, with the understanding that he'd take care of any resistance to the sale. Victoria's voice dropped to a whisper. I turned him down, obviously, but he said something that didn't make sense at the time. What? He said that sometimes the best way to acquire a company was to make the owner disappear, and that he'd found someone who specialized in making problems vanish permanently. The words hit Daniel like ice water. You think he hired a professional? I think we're dealing with someone who kills for money and has no qualms about using innocent children as leverage. Victoria's green eyes blazed with fury. Which means Emma isn't safe even if we comply with their demands. Daniel's world tilted on its axis. The careful life he'd built for his daughter, the routines, the safety measures, the illusion of security crumbled like sand. What are you saying? I'm saying that giving them what they want won't save Emma. It'll just make her a loose end to be tied up later. Victoria stood up, pacing to the windows that had become her prison. We can't run. We can't hide. We can't call for help. So we have to be smarter than they are. How? Victoria turned back to him, and Daniel saw something in her expression that reminded him why she'd built an empire from nothing. We make them think they've won, and then we destroy them. The next 18 hours passed in a blur of careful planning and barely controlled terror. Victoria went through the motions of a normal day, attending meetings and reviewing contracts, while her mind raced through contingencies and backup plans. Every interaction felt surreal, as if she were watching someone else live her life while she prepared for what might be her final performance. Daniel picked up Emma from school as usual, his heart breaking as she chattered about her science project and the boy who'd shared his cookies at lunch. She had no idea that her father had spent the morning researching security companies and self-defense techniques online, that her innocent routine had been mapped by strangers with deadly intentions. "Daddy, you seem sad today," Emma said as they walked to Mrs. Patterson's house. "Did something happen at work?" Daniel knelt down to her level, memorizing every detail of her face, the way her nose crinkled when she was concerned, the gap between her front teeth that made her lisp slightly when she said sad, the wild curls that refused to be tamed no matter how much he brushed them. "Just grown-up stuff, baby girl. Nothing for you to worry about." "Is it about money again?" Emma's 8-year-old wisdom cut straight to the heart of their struggles. "Because I don't need new shoes if it makes you sad." Daniel pulled her into a hug that lasted longer than usual, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo and the innocence that he'd die to protect. "I love you more than all the stars in the sky, Emma Hayes. Don't you ever forget that. I love you more than all the cookies in the world, Daddy. Even chocolate chip ones." As he walked to work that evening, Daniel felt like a man heading to his execution. The building that had been his refuge for 3 years now loomed over him, like a monument to everything he was about to lose. But alongside the terror, something else burned in his chest, a determination forged from love and desperation that made him capable of things he'd never imagined. Victoria arrived at Le Bernardin at exactly 8 o'clock, dressed in an emerald green dress that complemented her eyes and probably cost more than Daniel's monthly salary. She moved through the restaurant with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room, but Daniel, watching from his position as a consulting security specialist, the maitre d' had been paid to ignore, could see the tension in her shoulders. The restaurant was elegant in the way that only came with decades of reputation and prices that excluded anyone who counted pennies. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables where deals worth millions were discussed over wine that cost more than most people's rent. Victoria had chosen a table near the center of the dining room, visible to everyone, surrounded by witnesses, theoretically safe. But Daniel knew better. Poison was the perfect crime in a place like this, where exotic ingredients and complex preparations could hide any number of deadly additions. "Good evening, Ms. Lane," the waiter said with practiced charm. "Will anyone be joining you this evening?" "Just me tonight, Thomas. The usual table was perfect, thank you." Daniel watched from his corner position as Victoria ordered wine and appetizers with the calm of someone discussing the weather. But he could see her hands trembling slightly as she lifted her water glass, could read the fear in her eyes, despite the perfect smile she maintained for the staff. The dinner proceeded with agonizing normalcy. Victoria ate her appetizer, responded to text messages, even took a business call that seemed routine to anyone watching. But Daniel could feel the tension building like pressure in a steam engine, could sense the approaching moment when everything would explode into chaos. At 9:47, Thomas the waiter approached with a silver tray. "Compliments of the chef, Ms. Lane. Our signature chocolate soufflé with a special preparation just for you." Victoria's eyes found Daniel's across the room, and he saw his own terror reflected back at him. This was it. The moment they'd been dreading had arrived with all the ceremony of a last meal. "How thoughtful," Victoria said, her voice steady, despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. "It looks absolutely divine." Thomas set the dessert down with a flourish, the chocolate creation perfect in its presentation, dark, rich, and lethally beautiful. Steam rose from its center like incense at a funeral. "The chef wanted me to mention that this particular soufflé has been enhanced with a very rare ingredient," Thomas said with a smile that seemed innocent to everyone except the 2 people who understood its true meaning. "He's quite proud of the result." Victoria picked up her spoon, with hands that barely trembled, her training in corporate poker faces serving her well in what might be her final performance. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath as she lowered the spoon toward the dessert. Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. Every instinct screamed at him to act, to leap across the room and knock the spoon from her hand, to shout a warning that would save her life and doom his daughter. The weight of Emma's photo in his pocket felt like a stone dragging him toward the bottom of an ocean. But as Victoria's spoon touched the soufflé, something in her expression changed. A flicker of defiance, a spark of the ruthless intelligence that had built her empire. She looked directly at Daniel, and her lips moved in words only he could read. "Trust me." Then Victoria Lane, CEO of Sterling and Associates, lifted the poisoned spoon toward her mouth, and Daniel Hayes realized that sometimes the only way to win an impossible game was to change the rules entirely. The dessert hung suspended on the spoon, like a tiny brown guillotine, and in that frozen moment between life and death, Daniel understood that their carefully laid plans were about to collide with a reality that neither of them had fully anticipated. Whatever happened next would determine not just whether Victoria lived or died, but whether Emma would grow up with a father or become another casualty in a war she never should have been part of. The restaurant continued its elegant dance around them, unaware that they were witnessing the climax of a drama that had been building for months, that the woman in the emerald dress was either about to die or about to turn the tables on enemies who thought they held all the cards. And in the shadows, watching it all unfold with the intensity of a man whose world hung in the balance, Daniel prepared to do something that would either save them both or destroy everything he'd ever cared about. The spoon trembled for the briefest moment at Victoria's lips before she made a decision that would either prove her brilliance or seal her fate. Instead of eating the soufflé, she suddenly clutched her throat and began coughing violently, her face contorting in apparent distress. "Water!" she gasped, loud enough for half the restaurant to hear. "Something's wrong." The elegant dining room erupted into controlled chaos as Thomas rushed forward. Other waiters appeared from nowhere, and concerned diners turned to stare at the unfolding drama. But Daniel saw what others missed, Victoria's eyes sharp and calculating, even as she performed her medical emergency, scanning the room for reactions that would reveal their enemy. "Call an ambulance!" someone shouted from a nearby table. "Is she choking?" another voice called out. Victoria continued her performance, knocking over her water glass and sending the untouched soufflé sliding across the white tablecloth. The chocolate dessert splattered onto the floor in a mess that looked almost like blood in the restaurant's romantic lighting. "Please step back," Thomas said, his professional composure cracking as other staff members surrounded Victoria's table. "Miss Lane, can you breathe? Should we call 911? Daniel watched from his corner, heart pounding, as Victoria's brilliant improvisation bought them precious time. By refusing to eat the dessert and creating a public scene, she'd forced their would-be killers into an impossible position. They couldn't complete their mission without exposing themselves, but they also couldn't simply walk away and try again later. "I'm feeling better," Victoria said after another minute of theatrical gasping. I think I just had a reaction to something. Maybe the wine." She pressed a hand to her chest, breathing heavily, but no longer appearing to be in mortal danger. The restaurant manager appeared at her elbow, his face pale with concern and liability. "Fears. Ms. Lane, we're so sorry. Should we call our physician? We can arrange for immediate medical attention." No, I think I'll be fine." Victoria stood slowly, steadying herself against the table. "Perhaps I should head home and rest. If someone could call me a taxi." Daniel's admiration for her quick thinking was overshadowed by a growing sense of dread. Victoria had brilliantly avoided the immediate threat, but their enemies were still out there, still watching, still planning, and Emma was still in danger. As the restaurant staff fussed over Victoria and began cleaning up the spilled dessert, Daniel noticed something that made his blood run cold. Thomas, the waiter, had disappeared. In all the commotion, the man who'd delivered the poisoned soufflé had simply vanished, leaving behind only the scattered remains of their failed assassination attempt. Victoria caught Daniel's eye across the room and gave an almost imperceptible nod toward the exit. The message was clear. It was time to leave, time to regroup, time to figure out their next move before their enemies regrouped and tried again. But as Victoria gathered her purse and prepared to make her exit, Daniel's phone buzzed with a message that turned his relief into pure terror. "Very impressive performance. Too bad it won't save the little girl. We know where she sleeps." The photograph attached showed Emma's bedroom window, taken from outside their apartment building. His daughter's nightlight glowed softly behind glass that suddenly seemed as fragile as paper, and Daniel could see her stuffed elephant sitting on the windowsill, where she always placed it before bed. Victoria noticed his face go white and quickly made her way toward his corner of the restaurant, still playing the part of a woman recovering from a medical episode. "I need some air," she announced to the hovering staff. "The gentleman by the door offered to help me to my car." Daniel moved to her side with legs that felt like lead, offering his arm as they walked toward the exit. To anyone watching, they looked like a good Samaritan helping a sick woman. In reality, they were two people whose carefully orchestrated plan had just collapsed into nightmare. "They have Emma's location," Daniel whispered as they stepped onto the sidewalk. "They're at my apartment building." Victoria's composure finally cracked. "How is that possible? We had people watching." "What people?" Daniel's voice rose dangerously. "You said we couldn't trust anyone. You said involving others would make it worse." The accusation hung between them like a live wire. In the space of 30 seconds, their partnership had devolved into desperate finger-pointing as the reality of their situation crashed down around them. "Mr. Hayes, I hired a private security firm to monitor your daughter discreetly. Ex-military personnel with impeccable credentials." Victoria's voice shook with something between fear and fury. "If they've been compromised..." Daniel's phone rang, the shrill sound cutting through the night air like a scream. The caller ID showed Mrs. Patterson's number, and his heart stopped beating entirely. "Hello?" His voice came out as barely a whisper. "Daniel." Mrs. Patterson's voice was tight with fear. "I'm so sorry to call this late, but there are men outside the building. They've been there for an hour just watching. And Emma, she's asking for you. She says she had a bad dream about strangers." Daniel's knees nearly buckled. "Is she safe? Are you both safe? We're inside doors locked, but Daniel..." "One of them came to the door 20 minutes ago. Said he was from your work, that there was an emergency. I didn't let him in, but he knew things. He knew Emma's name, knew about her elephant, knew what grade she's in." The world tilted sideways as Daniel processed the information. These weren't random criminals or even professional assassins operating from a distance. These were people who'd studied his family with the thoroughness of scientists who knew every detail of their lives, down to his daughter's favorite stuffed animal. "Mrs. Patterson, listen to me very carefully," Daniel said, forcing his voice to remain calm. "Take Emma into your bedroom and lock the door. Push furniture in front of it if you have to. Don't open it for anyone except me, and only after I give you our safety word." "What safety word?" Daniel's mind raced. "Strawberry. If I don't say strawberry, don't open the door, no matter what you hear." "Daniel, you're scaring me." "I know. I'm scared too, but I'm coming to get you both right now." Victoria had been listening to the conversation with growing horror, and as Daniel hung up, she grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "You can't go there," she said urgently. "It's obviously a trap. They're using Emma as bait to draw you out." "She's my daughter." Daniel's control finally snapped. "I don't care if it's a trap. I don't care if they kill me. I won't leave her alone and scared while men with guns watch her bedroom window. If you get yourself killed, what happens to Emma then?" The question hit Daniel like a physical blow. As much as he wanted to charge across the city like an avenging angel, Victoria was right. His death wouldn't save Emma, it would just leave her completely defenseless against people who viewed children as disposable tools. "Then what do we do?" His voice cracked with the weight of impossible choices. Victoria pulled out her phone and began typing with the speed of someone accustomed to making life or death decisions under pressure. "We use the one advantage they don't know we have, which is..." They think we're helpless. They think you're just a scared janitor, and I'm just a target waiting to die." Victoria's eyes blazed with the kind of fury that had built empires and destroyed enemies. They have no idea what they've actually unleashed. As Victoria made rapid phone calls in a voice that could command armies, Daniel realized he was seeing a side of her that few people ever witnessed. This wasn't the polished CEO who attended charity galas and gave measured interviews to financial magazines. This was the woman who'd clawed her way to the top of a ruthless industry, who'd survived corporate warfare that would have destroyed weaker people who'd learned to fight with weapons most people couldn't even recognize. "Marcus Rothwell," she said into the phone, her voice cold as Arctic wind. "Yes, I know what time it is. Yes, this is about the dessert. You have exactly 30 seconds to call off your dogs before I release every piece of evidence I have about your money laundering operation to the FBI, the SEC, and the Washington Post." Daniel could hear shouting from the other end of the line, but Victoria's expression remained ice cold. "I'm not bluffing, Marcus, and I'm not negotiating. You threatened a child, which means you've crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell your hired killers to walk away from that apartment building right now, or I'm going to destroy you so completely that you'll spend the rest of your life in a federal prison cell, assuming you live long enough to make it to trial." More shouting, angrier this time. Victoria held the phone away from her ear and looked at Daniel with something that might have been satisfaction. "He's claiming he doesn't know what I'm talking about," she said, "which means either he's lying or we're dealing with someone else entirely." Daniel's phone buzzed again. Another photo, this one showing Mrs. Patterson's front door, with shadows visible in the hallway beyond. The message read, "30 minutes, come alone. No police, no security, no clever CEO tricks, just a father who wants to see his daughter again." "It's not Rothwell," Daniel said, showing Victoria the message. "Whoever's doing this, they're watching us right now. They know we're together, know we've been talking to him." Victoria's face went pale as the implications hit her. "If it's not Marcus, then who?" Her phone rang before she could finish the thought. The caller ID showed her mother's number, which was strange enough at this hour to send ice through Victoria's veins. "Mom?" "Victoria, darling, I hope I'm not calling too late." Her mother's voice sounded perfectly normal, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying. "I'm here with a friend of yours. He wanted to have a little chat." The phone was passed to someone else, and a man's voice came on the line, cultured, educated, and completely unfamiliar. "Ms. Lane, my name is Dr. Jonathan Ashford. I believe you know my work, even if you don't know my name." Victoria's blood turned to slush. Dr. Jonathan Ashford was a legend in corporate circles, a man who specialized in solving problems for high-net-worth clients who needed obstacles removed with absolute discretion. He was rumored to have connections in intelligence agencies, organized crime, and legitimate businesses across 3 continents. People like Marcus Rothwell hired consultants and lawyers. People with much deeper pockets and much darker needs hired Dr. Ashford. "What do you want?" Victoria's voice came out steadier than she felt. "What I've always wanted, Ms. Lane. To complete the contract I was hired to fulfill. Your death specifically, but accomplished in a way that appears accidental or natural. The poisoned dessert was elegant, but your little performance this evening has forced me to adjust my methods. If you hurt my mother, your mother is perfectly safe, as is young Emma Hayes, as long as everyone follows instructions precisely. You see, I'm not interested in harming innocent people. I'm simply a businessman fulfilling the terms of a very lucrative contract." Daniel leaned closer to the phone, his hands clenched into fists. "What kind of businessman threatens children?" Dr. Ashford chuckled, a sound like ice cracking. The kind who understands that leverage is more effective than violence, Mr. Hayes. Your daughter isn't in danger because I want to hurt her. She's in danger because her father's protective instincts make him predictable, and predictable people are easy to control. Who hired you? Victoria demanded. Now that Ms. Lane would be unprofessional. Let's simply say that someone with substantial resources wants your company, and you've proven remarkably resistant to more conventional acquisition methods. The pieces clicked into place in Victoria's mind like tumblers in a lock. The Yamamoto Group. They've been trying to break into the American market for 2 years. I neither confirm nor deny any client relationships. What I will tell you is that your death needs to appear accidental, which means that simply shooting you in a restaurant would be counterproductive to everyone's interests. Daniel's phone buzzed with another message, this one a video that made his heart stop entirely. Emma was visible through Mrs. Patterson's living room window, sitting on the couch in her pajamas, completely unaware that men with night vision equipment were watching her every movement. You see, Mr. Hayes, we're not monsters, Dr. Ashford continued. Your daughter is perfectly safe as long as her father makes intelligent decisions. But if you force us to change our plans, if you involve law enforcement or try to be heroic, well, accidents can happen to anyone. Victoria grabbed Daniel's arm as she saw him start to move toward the street. Don't, she whispered urgently. He's baiting you. Ms. Lane is quite right, Dr. Ashford said, apparently having heard her comment. This is indeed a carefully orchestrated psychological manipulation designed to force Mr. Hayes into predictable behavior. The question is whether knowing that changes anything. Daniel closed his eyes, his mind racing through options that all seemed to lead to disaster. Run to Emma's location and walk into a trap that would likely get them both killed. Stay put and hope that professional killers would honor their word about not harming children. Call the police and risk triggering exactly the kind of violent response they were trying to avoid. What do you want us to do? Victoria asked. Simple. Miss Lane will meet me at the location I'm about to send to her phone. Alone, unarmed, with no surveillance or backup of any kind. She'll consume a beverage I provide which will cause her to suffer what appears to be a massive heart attack. Very sad, very natural, and completely unconnected to any business disputes or corporate warfare. And Emma, once Miss Lane is dead, and I've fulfilled my contract. Your daughter goes back to her normal life. She'll never even know that her father briefly became involved in something far beyond his understanding. Victoria and Daniel stared at each other in the flickering light of a street lamp, both understanding that they'd reached the moment where all their careful planning and desperate scheming had led them. The choice was stark and simple, Victoria's life for Emma's safety. There's a third option, Victoria said quietly. Dr. Ashford chuckled again. I'm listening. You said your client wants my company. What if I simply gave it to them, signed over controlling interest, transferred ownership, walked away from everything I've built? An interesting proposal, but unfortunately incomplete. You see, Ms. Lane, you know too much about your competitors' methods. You've seen evidence of how business is conducted at the highest levels. Letting you live even in retirement would create an unacceptable risk of future complications. Daniel felt something snap inside his chest, a sound like breaking glass, that he recognized as the moment when ordinary people discover they're capable of extraordinary violence. There's a fourth option, he said, his voice deadly quiet. Oh, I kill you before you can hurt either of them. Dr. Ashford's laughter was genuinely amused this time. Mr. Hayes, I appreciate your protective instincts, but you're a maintenance worker with no combat training, no weapons, and no idea where I am. I, on the other hand, have been eliminating problems like you for longer than your daughter has been alive. Maybe, but you made one mistake. Which is, Daniel looked at Victoria, seeing his own desperate determination reflected in her green eyes. You assumed I was just a janitor before Dr. Ashford could respond. Daniel ended the call and turned to Victoria with an expression she'd never seen before. Not the careful politeness of an employee, or the desperate fear of a threatened father, but something harder and infinitely more dangerous. What did you mean? Victoria asked. I meant that I lied on my job application 3 years ago. Daniel's voice was steady now, calm in a way that reminded Victoria of soldiers in movies. I wasn't just studying engineering at community college. I was also serving in the Army Reserve, and I spent 18 months in Afghanistan as part of a military police unit. Victoria stared at him as pieces of the puzzle rearranged themselves in her mind. You have combat experience. I have experience finding people who don't want to be found and neutralizing threats to civilians. Daniel pulled out his phone and began scrolling through contacts she'd never seen him access. I also have friends who owe me favors, friends who never quite made it back to civilian life the way I did. What are you saying? I'm saying that Dr. Ashford made the same mistake everyone makes. He looked at my uniform and my paycheck and assumed he knew everything about me. Daniel's eyes met hers, and Victoria saw something there that was both terrifying and oddly comforting. He's about to learn that some janitors clean up messes in ways that don't involve mops. As Daniel made his phone calls, speaking in the kind of military shorthand that Victoria had only heard in movies, she realized that their impossible situation had just become something else entirely. They were no longer helpless victims being manipulated by a professional killer. They were no longer playing defense against an enemy who held all the cards. For the first time since this nightmare began, they were about to go on the offensive. The war for Emma's life and Victoria's survival was about to begin in earnest, and Dr. Jonathan Ashford was about to discover that threatening a father's child was the kind of mistake that could get even the most careful professional killed. The first call Daniel made was to a number he hadn't dialed in 3 years, but his fingers remembered the sequence like muscle memory. When the gravelly voice answered on the second ring, Daniel felt a piece of his old self click back into place. Reaper Jesus Christ, is that really you? Hey Tank, I need a favor. Master Sergeant Robert "Tank" Morrison had been Daniel's squad leader in Afghanistan, a mountain of a man who could disarm an IED with hands steady as stone and navigate hostile territory like he'd grown up there. More importantly, Tank had made Daniel promise to call if civilian life ever got too complicated for one man to handle. Talk to me, brother. What's the situation? Daniel gave him the condensed version: professional killer, threatened child, corporate conspiracy, ticking clock. Tank listened without interruption, the way he'd listened to mission briefings in places where mistakes got people killed. Location: New York, Manhattan. I can send coordinates. Assets: just me and one civilian. High-value target but no combat experience. Opposition: unknown number, professional grade, international connections. Tank was quiet for 30 seconds, and Daniel could practically hear him calculating odds and resources across the phone line. I'm 4 hours out by road, 2 hours if I commandeer a helicopter from my buddy at McGuire Air Force Base. Can you maintain position until then? Negative. They have eyes on my daughter now. This moves fast or it moves bloody. Roger that. Tank's voice shifted into the command tone that had kept their unit alive through 18 months of hell. I'm activating the network. Phoenix, Warhammer, and Ghost are all within driving distance. We'll have boots on ground in 90 minutes. Victoria listened to this exchange with growing amazement. The man she'd known as a quiet janitor was speaking in military terminology with the confidence of someone who'd commanded life-or-death operations. When Daniel ended the call, she realized she'd been holding her breath. Who are Phoenix, Warhammer, and Ghost? Sarah Martinez was our communications specialist. Army Rangers before she transferred to our unit. Now she runs a private security firm in Jersey. Daniel was already dialing the next number. Jake Warhammer Williams was explosive ordnance disposal. He's working construction in Queens, but he never forgot how to make things go boom. And Tommy Ghost Chen was reconnaissance. If there's something to find in this city, he'll find it. The transformation was remarkable. The careful, deferential janitor had disappeared entirely, replaced by a man who moved and spoke with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to operating under extreme pressure. Victoria found herself seeing Daniel Hayes clearly for the first time, not as an employee or a victim, but as a soldier who'd learned to hide his training behind a mop and a minimum wage paycheck. Phoenix, it's Reaper, Daniel said into the phone. I need a full tactical package in Manhattan Timeline immediate. We have hostile surveillance on a civilian target and at least one confirmed professional operator. Sarah's voice was crisp and professional when she responded. Location for gear delivery. Sending coordinates now. And Phoenix, bring the good stuff. We're going up against someone with serious backing. Copy that. Inbound with full kit in 60 minutes. As Daniel made his remaining calls, Victoria processed the implications of what she was witnessing. Her quiet night janitor was assembling a team of military veterans with combat experience and access to weapons that definitely weren't available at the local sporting goods store. The careful, law-abiding single father was about to wage a private war in the middle of Manhattan. Daniel, she said quietly, what you're planning, this isn't Afghanistan. This is American soil with American laws and American consequences. Daniel looked at her with eyes that had seen too much death to be intimidated by legal technicalities. Dr. Ashford and his people already decided that American laws don't apply to this situation. They're holding my daughter hostage and planning to murder you in cold blood. As far as I'm concerned, they forfeited any protection those laws might have offered them. Victoria's phone buzzed with a new message from Dr. Ashford. Warehouse District, Pier 47, 1 hour. Come alone or the child dies first. The address was in a part of the city where screams wouldn't be heard and bodies could disappear into the Hudson River without a trace. Victoria had attended enough corporate negotiations to recognize the psychological advantage of choosing the terrain. Dr. Ashford was forcing them to come to him on his terms, in a location where he controlled every variable. It's a kill box, Daniel said, reading the address over her shoulder. He's not planning to honor any deals. He's planning to eliminate all loose ends in one convenient location. Then we don't go. We can't not go. He has my mother and his people are watching Emma. Victoria's voice was steady, but Daniel could see the fear she was trying so hard to control. If we don't show up, he'll start killing people just to prove he can. Daniel's phone rang again. Tank's voice came through with the background noise of what sounded like helicopters. Change of plans, Reaper. Ghost did some electronic reconnaissance on your Dr. Ashford. This guy's not just connected, he's officially non-existent. No records, no fingerprints, no digital footprint that goes back more than 5 years. Meaning he's either a foreign intelligence asset or he's so deep in the Black Ops world that he might as well be. Either way, you're not dealing with a civilian contractor. You're dealing with someone who has government-level resources and zero accountability. Victoria felt the last of her hope crumble. Bad enough to be hunted by a professional killer, but if Dr. Ashford had intelligence agency backing, they were fighting an enemy with unlimited resources and no legal constraints. It gets worse, Tank continued. Phoenix intercepted communications suggesting this isn't just about your CEO friend. Word is someone paid big money to make this look like the opening move in a larger operation. They want Sterling and Associates, but they also want to send a message to other American companies about what happens when they refuse foreign acquisition offers. Daniel absorbed this information with the calm of someone who'd faced impossible odds before. So we're not just saving Victoria and Emma, we're preventing an act of economic terrorism. Bingo. Which means if you pull this off, you'll have some very grateful people in very high places. And if you don't, we all disappear and this never happened. Roger that. Victoria listened to this exchange with growing disbelief. In the space of 2 hours, her quiet corporate world had exploded into something that sounded like the plot of a spy thriller. Foreign agents, economic terrorism, black ops assassins, it was too much to process. Too surreal to be happening to a woman whose biggest worry that morning had been a quarterly earnings report. But Emma's face in those surveillance photos was real. Her mother's frightened voice on the phone was real. And the man standing beside her, methodically preparing for a war she couldn't have imagined, was very real. "What do you need from me?" she asked. Daniel studied her for a moment, and Victoria saw him making calculations that had nothing to do with corporate strategy. "I need you to trust me completely, even when what I'm asking doesn't make sense. I need you to follow orders instantly, without question or hesitation. And I need you to understand that once this starts, there's no going back to the way things were." Victoria thought about her perfectly ordered life board meetings and profit margins, charity galas, and business dinners, the safe, predictable world she'd built around herself, like armor. Then she thought about Dr. Ashford's voice, cold and professional, as he discussed her murder like a routine business transaction. "What's the plan?" Daniel's smile was sharp as a blade. "We give Dr. Ashford exactly what he's expecting. A terrified CEO and a desperate father walking into his trap with no weapons, no backup, and no hope. That sounds like suicide. Only if he realizes it's not true." The next hour passed in a blur of preparation that Victoria would remember for the rest of her life, assuming she lived long enough to have memories. Sarah. Phoenix Martinez arrived in an unmarked van loaded with equipment that looked like it belonged in a war zone. She was a compact woman with intelligent eyes and the kind of controlled movements that suggested coiled springs. "Reaper," she said, embracing Daniel like a sister. "Thought I'd never see you suiting up again." "Thought I wouldn't either. But sometimes the war finds you whether you're ready or not." Phoenix looked Victoria up and down with professional assessment. "Your principal, Victoria Lane, CEO, no combat experience but smart and brave enough to get us this far." "Ma'am," Phoenix extended a hand with surprising gentleness. "Don't worry. We're very good at keeping people alive." The gear Phoenix produced was unlike anything Victoria had seen outside of movies. Body armor that looked like business clothing, communication devices smaller than earbuds, weapons that seemed to materialize from nowhere. But what impressed her most was the quiet competence of the people handling it all. Jake Warhammer Williams arrived next, a stocky man with scarred hands, and the kind of smile that suggested he enjoyed his work a little too much. He brought a duffel bag that clinked ominously when he set it down. "Heard we're doing some urban renovation," he said to Daniel. "I brought party favors." "Non-lethal if possible," Daniel replied. "We've got civilians in the mix." "I got you covered. Flashbangs smoke some very persuasive breaching charges. Should be enough to make our new friends reconsider their life choices." Tommy Ghost Chen was the last to arrive, and Victoria barely saw him until he spoke from directly behind her. He was small, quiet, and moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd learned to be invisible as a survival skill. Perimeter is compromised, he reported to Daniel. Minimum 4 surveillance teams, probably more. They're tracking every move we make. Good, Daniel said, surprising everyone. Let them watch. I want them confident and predictable. Victoria was beginning to understand the elegance of Daniel's plan. Dr. Ashford expected them to arrive at Pier 47 defeated and helpless, ready to be eliminated like pieces on a chessboard. He wouldn't be looking for a coordinated military assault, because nothing in Daniel's background suggested he was capable of mounting one. What about Emma? Victoria asked. If we're walking into a trap, how do we protect her? Daniel's expression softened for a moment, revealing the father beneath the soldier. That's where you come in. Phoenix is going to teach you how to use some very sophisticated electronics. While Dr. Ashford is focused on us, you're going to help us locate and extract Emma and my mother. I don't understand. Phoenix pulled out a device that looked like a high-end smartphone crossed with a military radio. Thermal imaging, encrypted communications, real-time tactical mapping. You'll be our eyes and ears while the boys make noise. Victoria stared at the device, overwhelmed by the complexity of what they were asking her to do. I run board meetings, not military operations. Same skill set, Daniel said with surprising gentleness. You coordinate resources, make decisions under pressure, and adapt when situations change. The only difference is the stakes. The stakes are my daughter's life. No, Victoria said quietly, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. The stakes are all of our lives. Emma, your mother, you, me, we're all targets now. And the only way any of us survive is if we stop thinking like victims and start thinking like victors. Daniel looked at her with something that might have been pride. Phoenix, show her how to use the gear. Warhammer. I need you to rig the warehouse with enough surprises to keep Dr. Ashford's people busy. Ghost full reconnaissance on their positions. I want to know how many shooters they have and where they're hiding. What about you? Victoria asked. I'm going to call Dr. Ashford back and arrange our surrender. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Daniel would contact Dr. Ashford and agree to meet at Pier 47, bringing Victoria as requested. They would appear to be defeated, frightened, and completely under his control. What Dr. Ashford wouldn't know was that Phoenix would be providing overwatch from a neighboring building. Warhammer would have rigged the warehouse with enough explosive surprises to level the block, and Ghost would be moving through the shadows like a deadly specter. Victoria's role was the most crucial and most dangerous. Using Phoenix's equipment, she would locate Emma and Daniel's mother while appearing to be nothing more than a terrified CEO waiting to die. When the shooting started, and Daniel assured her it would start, she would guide the extraction team to the hostages, while Daniel and his team neutralized the threats. How do you know it will work? Victoria asked, as Phoenix strapped nearly invisible armor beneath her dress. I don't, Daniel admitted. But Dr. Ashford made one crucial mistake. He assumed that threatening Emma would make me predictable and controllable. Instead, it just reminded me who I used to be before I became someone who counted every penny and worried about rent increases. Victoria saw something dangerous flicker behind Daniel's eyes, a glimpse of the soldier who'd survived combat tours and come home to build a quiet life around his daughter's safety. Dr. Ashford had awakened something that had been sleeping for 3 years, and Victoria suspected their enemy had no idea what kind of force he'd unleashed. Daniel, she said quietly, what happens after this is over, assuming we all survive? I don't know, he admitted. I never thought past keeping Emma safe. I have, Victoria said, surprising both of them. I've been thinking about what it means to have employees who are willing to risk everything to protect their families. About what it says about a company when its CEO discovers that the man who cleans her floors is braver and more capable than any executive she's ever hired. Daniel looked at her with confusion. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if we survive this, I want to offer you a job that doesn't involve mopping floors. Something that uses the skills you've been hiding behind a janitor's uniform." Victoria I, head of corporate security, she continued. "Salary to match your actual qualifications, benefits that will let Emma go to any college she wants, and the kind of work that might actually be worthy of the man who's about to risk his life to save mine." Daniel stared at her, and Victoria saw the exact moment when he allowed himself to imagine a future beyond the next few hours. A future where Emma didn't have to worry about whether they could afford school supplies, where he didn't have to work 3 jobs to keep their heads above water, where his military experience became an asset instead of something to hide on job applications. "Ask me again tomorrow," he said finally, assuming we're both alive to have the conversation. Phoenix finished adjusting Victoria's equipment and stepped back with professional satisfaction. "You're wired for sound, and video thermal imaging is calibrated, and the panic button will bring the cavalry running. Try not to get shot." "Try not to get shot," Victoria repeated. "Great advice. Why didn't I think of that?" Daniel's phone rang. Dr. Ashford's number appeared on the screen like a death sentence. "Time to go," Daniel said, answering the call. "Dr. Ashford, we're ready to meet your terms." "Excellent. I do appreciate reasonable people. Pier 47 warehouse entrance 15 minutes. What about the hostages?" "They'll be returned unharmed once our business is concluded. You have my word." Daniel looked at Victoria, and she saw her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. Dr. Ashford's word was worth exactly nothing. The man who'd threatened a child and planned to murder them both in cold blood had no intention of letting anyone walk away from this meeting. But that was fine, because Daniel Hayes, former military police protective father and man who'd spent 3 years pretending to be less than he was, had no intention of letting Dr. Ashford walk away either. The war for Emma's life was about to begin, and Victoria realized that despite the terror coursing through her veins, she'd never felt more alive. Tomorrow, if they survived, she would wake up in a world where a single father's courage had saved not just his daughter, but potentially prevented an act of international terrorism disguised as corporate acquisition. Tonight, she was about to discover whether the man who cleaned her floors was capable of cleaning up a mess that threatened to destroy everything they both held dear. The warehouse district loomed ahead of them like a concrete maze designed for violence, and somewhere in that maze, Dr. Jonathan Ashford was waiting with enough firepower to eliminate every witness to his carefully orchestrated crime. But he was about to learn that some janitors specialized in taking out trash that fought back. The warehouse at Pier 47 squatted against the Hudson River like a concrete beast, its broken windows staring out at the dark water with empty malevolence. Victoria felt the weight of Phoenix's equipment beneath her dress as she and Daniel approached the rusted entrance, every step echoing against wet pavement that gleamed like oil under the sparse streetlights. "Remember," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible through the communication device hidden in her ear. "You're terrified but compliant. Let them think you've given up." Victoria nodded, though her heart was hammering so hard she was certain Dr. Ashford would hear it from inside the building. The thermal imaging device disguised as a phone showed at least 12 heat signatures scattered throughout the warehouse, more than they'd expected, but not enough to change the plan. The entrance door stood slightly ajar, light spilling out like blood from a wound. Daniel reached for the handle with hands that looked steady, but Victoria could see the slight tremor that revealed his own fear. Not for himself, she realized, but for Emma, who was somewhere in that concrete maze trusting her father to bring her home safe. "After you, Ms. Lane," Dr. Ashford's cultured voice called from somewhere in the shadows beyond the door. "Mr. Hayes, please keep your hands visible." They stepped into the warehouse and Victoria's breath caught in her throat. The space was enormous, filled with shipping containers stacked like metal building blocks, creating a labyrinth of blind corners and hidden passages. Overhead, ancient fluorescent lights flickered with irregular rhythms, casting dancing shadows that could hide an army. Dr. Ashford emerged from behind a container 30 feet away, and Victoria's first thought was how ordinary he looked. Medium height, silver hair, expensive suit, he could have been any corporate executive attending a business dinner. Only his eyes betrayed his true nature, cold and calculating as a snake's. Punctual. I appreciate that in people who are about to die. Daniel stepped slightly in front of Victoria, a protective gesture that looked unconscious, but she recognized as tactical positioning. "Where are they?" "Patience, Mr. Hayes. First, we need to discuss the terms of Ms. Lane's unfortunate demise." Dr. Ashford pulled out a small vial filled with clear liquid, holding it up to catch the flickering light. "A synthetic compound that mimics the effects of a massive coronary event. Completely undetectable in standard autopsy procedures and absolutely unstoppable once administered." Victoria forced herself to look terrified instead of furious. "What about your promise you said if I came here? I said your mother and the child would be unharmed. I never said anything about letting them go." Dr. Ashford's smile was razor-thin. "They'll serve as insurance against Mr. Hayes developing any heroic impulses." That was the signal Daniel had been waiting for. His hand moved to his jacket pocket in a gesture that looked like nervous fidgeting, but was actually activating a transmitter that would alert his team to begin the assault. "You don't have to do this," Daniel said, playing his part perfectly. "Take the company, take whatever you want, but let them go." "Oh, but I do have to do this, Mr. Hayes. You see, Ms. Lane knows too much about my client's acquisition methods, and you've seen too much to be allowed to simply walk away." Victoria's thermal imaging device was showing movement throughout the warehouse. Ghost positioning himself for the first strike. Warhammer approaching the container where Emma and Victoria's mother were being held. Phoenix preparing to provide sniper support from her position across the street. "However," Dr. Ashford continued, "I'm not without mercy. Ms. Lane's death will be quick and relatively painless. And Mr. Hayes, you'll have the comfort of knowing that your daughter will be adopted by a very nice family in Eastern Europe who specialize in providing new identities for children whose parents have become inconvenient." The words hit Daniel like physical blows, but Victoria saw something deadly flicker behind his eyes. Dr. Ashford had just made his second crucial mistake, the first being threatening Emma at all, the second being describing her fate in enough detail to guarantee that Daniel would never stop hunting him, no matter what happened in this warehouse. "You're insane," Victoria said, letting real emotion bleed into her voice. "I'm practical. Now if you'll please drink this." Dr. Ashford held out the vial. "We can conclude our business, and I can be back in Geneva by tomorrow evening." And Victoria reached for the vial with hands that shook just enough to look convincing. But as her fingers closed around the glass, Daniel's voice cut through the warehouse like a blade. "Emma Strawberry." The warehouse exploded into chaos. The first explosion came from the eastern wall, where Warhammer had placed charges designed to create maximum noise and confusion without bringing down the building. The blast shattered windows and sent shipping containers rocking like toys, while brilliant white light flooded the space as military-grade flares turned night into blazing day. Victoria threw herself behind the nearest container as Dr. Ashford's men opened fire, their muzzle flashes creating a deadly light show in the smoke-filled air. She could hear Daniel shouting commands, Phoenix's rifle cracking from her overwatch position, and somewhere in the chaos, a child's voice calling for her daddy. "Emma!" Daniel's voice roared over the gunfire. "Stay down, baby girl. Daddy's coming." Victoria activated her thermal imaging and began moving through the maze of containers, following the heat signatures that Phoenix had identified as their targets. Her business heels weren't designed for combat, but she kicked them off and ran barefoot across concrete that was now littered with broken glass and spent shell casings. Ghost materialized beside her like a shadow. Given form, his movements so quiet she didn't realize he was there until he spoke. "Hostages are in Container 7 Alpha 30 meters northwest. 2 guards, both armed, both focused on the main fight." Victoria nodded and followed him through the maze, her heart hammering, as explosions continued to rock the warehouse. Daniel's plan was working. Dr. Ashford's men were so focused on the frontal assault that they weren't watching their flanks. Container 7 Alpha was a standard shipping container that had been converted into a makeshift prison cell. Through the thermal imaging, Victoria could see 3 heat signatures inside, 2 small and huddled together, 1 larger and moving with the nervous energy of a guard, trying to decide whether to stay with his prisoners or join the fight. Ghost produced a device that looked like a sophisticated can opener and began working on the container's lock. 60 seconds, he whispered. Victoria positioned herself to provide cover, though she'd never fired a gun in her life, and wasn't sure she could if the moment came. But as she heard Emma's frightened voice through the metal walls, she discovered that protective instincts could overcome a lifetime of peaceful living. "Mama Victoria's here, sweetie," she called softly, using the name Emma had given her during their brief meeting at the office. "We're going to get you out." "Is my daddy okay?" Emma's voice was small and scared, but not broken. "Your daddy is being very brave," Victoria replied, her throat tight with emotion she didn't expect. "He's coming to get you." Ghost's device clicked, and the container door swung open. Victoria's mother stumbled out first, her designer clothes torn, but her eyes blazing with fury instead of fear. "Victoria, thank God. They said they were going to—" "Later, Mom. Right now we need to move." Emma appeared in the doorway, and Victoria's heart broke at the sight of her. 8 years old, still in her pajamas, clutching her stuffed elephant like a lifeline. But her eyes were alert and intelligent, and when she saw Victoria, she managed a brave smile. "Mama Victoria, you came to save me." Victoria swept the little girl into her arms, surprised by how natural it felt to hold her. "Of course I did, sweetheart. That's what families do." Ghost was already moving toward the exit route he'd mapped, but Victoria heard something that made her blood freeze, Daniel's voice distorted by pain and fury. "Ashford. Let's finish this." Through the smoke and chaos, Victoria could see the 2 men facing each other in the center of the warehouse. Dr. Ashford held a gun, while Daniel appeared to be unarmed, but Victoria recognized the stance her newly revealed soldier had taken. He was preparing for hand-to-hand combat, drawing his enemy into range where superior firepower wouldn't matter. "You should have stayed invisible, Mr. Hayes," Dr. Ashford called out, his cultured voice echoing off the container walls. "Janitors don't get to play hero." "You're right," Daniel replied, circling slowly as years of military training reasserted itself. "But fathers do." Dr. Ashford raised his weapon, but Daniel was already moving. 3 years of mopping floors had kept him in better shape than his enemy realized, and muscle memory from Afghanistan guided his movements as he closed the distance in a blur of controlled violence. The gun fired, but Daniel had anticipated the shot, dropping and rolling as the bullet sparked off concrete. He came up inside Dr. Ashford's guard, and Victoria heard the distinctive sound of breaking bones as Daniel's training took over. "That's for threatening my daughter," Daniel said as Dr. Ashford hit the ground. The fight was over in less than 30 seconds. Dr. Ashford lay unconscious on the warehouse floor, while Daniel stood over him breathing hard, but victorious. Around them, the sounds of battle were fading as Phoenix and Warhammer finished mopping up the remaining threats. "Daddy!" Emma broke free from Victoria's arms and ran toward her father, her stuffed elephant bouncing behind her. Daniel caught her in a hug that seemed to last forever, his face buried in her wild curls, as 3 years of carefully controlled emotions finally broke free. "I was so scared, Daddy, but I knew you'd come. You always come. Always." Daniel whispered, his voice thick with tears he'd been holding back since this nightmare began. "I will always come for you, baby girl." Victoria watched the reunion with tears streaming down her own face, suddenly understanding something that all her corporate success had never taught her. This was what winning actually looked like, not profit margins or market share, but a father holding his daughter safe in his arms while the world burned down around them. "Ma'am," Phoenix approached with professional satisfaction. "Area secure. All hostiles neutralized or in custody. Local PD and federal agents are inbound." Victoria nodded, then looked at Dr. Ashford's unconscious form. "What happens to him?" "That depends on which agency gets to him first," Phoenix replied. "But between the attempted murder, international terrorism, and child endangerment charges, I'd say he's going to spend the rest of his life in a place that makes this warehouse look like a resort." As sirens wailed in the distance, Victoria felt the weight of the night's events settle over her like a heavy blanket. In 12 hours, her carefully ordered world had exploded into violence and terror, but it had also revealed truths that would change everything going forward. Daniel approached with Emma in his arms, both of them looking exhausted but alive. "Victoria," he said quietly, "I can't thank you enough. You risked everything for us." "No," Victoria replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "You risked everything for me. And Emma. Emma risked everything just by being brave enough to trust that her daddy would save her." Emma looked at Victoria with the serious expression that only children could manage. "Are you going to be part of our family now, Mama Victoria?" The question hit Victoria like a physical blow. She looked at Daniel, seeing her own confusion reflected in his eyes, then at Emma's hopeful face, then at her own mother, who was watching the exchange with knowing satisfaction. Victoria started, then stopped. The corporate vocabulary that had served her so well in boardrooms suddenly seemed inadequate for this moment. "What Emma means," Daniel said gently, "is that we've all been through something that changes people. We're not the same as we were 12 hours ago." Victoria nodded, understanding flooding through her like sunlight. "No, we're not." 6 months later, Victoria stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office, watching the city that had almost become her graveyard. But the view was different now because everything was different now. Sterling and Associates had not only survived the attempted hostile takeover, it had emerged stronger than ever. The international attention from Dr. Ashford's arrest had led to new clients, new opportunities, and a reputation for being the kind of company that protected its people no matter what the cost. Daniel Hayes, former janitor and current head of corporate security, knocked on her door with the same politeness he'd always shown, but now it came with the confidence of a man who'd found his proper place in the world. "The Yamamoto Group situation?" Victoria asked without preamble. "Resolved. Turns out they were very eager to negotiate once their previous consultant was indicted for terrorism." Daniel's smile was sharp with satisfaction. "They've agreed to our terms for the joint venture, and they're paying a substantial penalty for their previous acquisition methods. And Dr. Ashford, sentenced to life without parole. Federal prison, maximum security, no possibility of escape or early release." Daniel's expression darkened slightly. The judge was particularly unimpressed with the child endangerment charges. Victoria nodded, then gestured toward the chair across from her desk. Sit. We need to talk about something else. Daniel settled into the chair with the easy grace he'd developed over the past 6 months. The transformation had been remarkable: designer suits instead of maintenance uniforms, an office on the executive floor instead of a supply closet, and most importantly, the confidence that came from using his real skills instead of hiding them. Emma's science fair project. Victoria smiled. Among other things, she asked me to help her with the presentation on career changes and personal growth. She picked an interesting topic. She picked an interesting subject to interview. Victoria leaned back in her chair. According to her research, some of the most successful people in business are those who've learned to adapt when circumstances change dramatically. Daniel chuckled. 8-year-olds can be surprisingly wise. Speaking of wise 8-year-olds, she also asked me something yesterday that I've been thinking about. Which was... Victoria felt her heart speed up slightly, the same way it had during those terrifying moments in the warehouse. She asked when I was going to officially become part of the family. The words hung in the air between them, like a bridge neither was sure they were ready to cross. 6 months of working together, of family dinners where Emma insisted Mama Victoria had to attend, of gradually building something that looked remarkably like the life Victoria had never dared to imagine. Victoria, Daniel said carefully. Emma's been through a lot. Sometimes she gets confused about relationships and boundaries. Does she? Victoria stood up and moved to the windows, looking down at the street where normal people lived, normal lives without corporate conspiracies or assassination attempts. Because I've been wondering if maybe she sees something that the adults in the room are too scared to acknowledge. Daniel joined her at the window, and Victoria could feel the warmth of his presence like sunlight. What are you saying? I'm saying that 6 months ago, I was a woman who had everything except the things that actually mattered. Success without purpose, wealth without love, power without the people worth protecting. Victoria turned to face him, seeing her own emotions reflected in his eyes. And then a single father with the courage to save my life taught me what I'd been missing. Victoria. I'm also saying that Emma needs a mother. You deserve someone who understands what you risked for people you barely knew. And I've discovered that the family I never thought I wanted has been right in front of me this whole time. Daniel stared at her for a long moment, and Victoria could see him processing the implications of what she was suggesting. Not just romance, but the complete restructuring of 2 lives that had found their way to each other through violence and terror, and emerged stronger on the other side. Are you asking what I think you're asking? Victoria reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a small velvet box, her hands shaking only slightly, as she opened it to reveal a simple but elegant ring. Daniel Hayes, former janitor, current head of security, and the bravest man I've ever known, she said, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening in her chest. Will you marry me? Daniel's laughter was rich and genuine, filled with joy, instead of the careful politeness she'd known for so long. Most women wait for the man to propose. Most women aren't CEOs who've learned that sometimes you have to take charge of your own happiness. Victoria smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. Besides, Emma helped me pick out the ring. She said it had to be perfect for her daddy. Daniel took the ring from the box with hands that trembled slightly, studying it in the afternoon light streaming through the windows. She helped you pick this out. She's been planning this proposal for 3 months. Apparently, 8-year-old girls are much better at reading romantic tension than the adults experiencing it. In that case, Daniel said, slipping the ring onto his finger with a smile that could have powered the entire building. I can't possibly say no. Emma would never forgive me. Victoria kissed him, then there in her office overlooking the city that had almost killed them both, and realized that sometimes the best things in life came disguised as the worst. Terror had become love, desperation had become strength, and a chance encounter between a CEO and a janitor had become the foundation for a family that none of them had seen coming. 6 months later, on a perfect spring afternoon in Central Park, Victoria Lane became Victoria Hayes in a ceremony attended by Tank Phoenix Warhammer Ghost and approximately 50 other people whose lives had been touched by their story. Emma served as maid of honor, wearing a dress that matched her new mother's and carrying her stuffed elephant as something borrowed. During the reception, as Victoria danced with her husband while their daughter spun in circles nearby, she caught sight of a familiar figure in the crowd. A young woman in a maintenance uniform watching the celebration with the same careful invisibility that Victoria remembered from her own past. Victoria excused herself from the dance floor and approached the woman with a smile that held no trace of the arrogance she'd once worn like armor. "I'm Victoria Hayes," she said, extending her hand. "I don't think we've met." The woman looked surprised to be acknowledged. "Maria Santos, ma'am. I clean the offices at Sterling & Associates, night shift." "How long have you been with the company, Maria?" "6 months, ma'am. It's a good job, steady." Victoria heard the echo of Daniel's words from that night in the office, the careful gratitude of someone who'd learned not to ask for more than survival. "Do you have family, Maria?" Maria's face lit up with the same transformation Victoria had seen in Daniel when he spoke about Emma. "2 boys. Miguel is 10, Carlos is 7. They're good kids." Victoria nodded, making mental notes about school districts and after-school programs and the kind of opportunities that every child deserved. "Maria, would you be interested in hearing about some other positions at Sterling & Associates? We're always looking for people who take pride in their work, and I have a feeling you might have skills we haven't discovered yet." As Victoria watched hope bloom in Maria's eyes, she understood that their story wasn't ending with this wedding. It was beginning a new chapter 1 where the lessons learned in that warehouse would ripple outward to touch other lives, other families, other single parents who just needed someone to see past their uniforms to the people underneath. Daniel appeared at her elbow with Emma riding on his shoulders, both of them glowing with happiness that was infectious. "Making new friends?" he asked, extending his hand to Maria with the same warmth Victoria had learned to expect from the man who'd once risked everything for strangers. "Actually," Victoria said, her arm slipping around her husband's waist as naturally as breathing. "I think I'm expanding the family." Emma clapped her hands from her perch on Daniel's shoulders. "The more the merrier, that's what Daddy always says." As the sun set over Central Park, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Victoria Hayes looked around at the life she'd never planned but couldn't imagine living without. A husband who'd taught her that true strength came from protecting the people you love. A daughter who'd shown her that family wasn't just about blood, but about choosing to love someone enough to fight for them. And a future filled with possibilities she was only beginning to understand. The woman who'd once sat alone in corporate towers surrounded by success but starved of purpose was gone forever. In her place stood someone who understood that the most important acquisitions weren't companies or contracts, but connections with people brave enough to risk everything for each other. And somewhere in the crowd, a night janitor named Maria Santos was about to discover that sometimes the most extraordinary changes begin with the simplest gesture, someone powerful enough to change your life, deciding that you're worth the effort. The story that had begun with a desperate shout across an elegant restaurant was becoming something larger. Something that would ripple through countless lives in ways none of them could predict. Because that's what real love does. It transforms not just the people who find it, but everyone they touch along the way. As fireworks began to explode over the city, Emma pointed at the sky with wonder, while her parents held each other close. Victoria understood that this was what winning actually looked like. Not profit margins or market dominance, but a child's laughter echoing through the night, while the people who love her most prepare to give her a world full of possibilities. The Ferrari was still parked outside their brownstone when they got home that night, gleaming under the streetlights like a symbol of everything that had changed. But now it wasn't just Victoria's car. It was the family car, the one that would take them on weekend trips and school visits and all the ordinary adventures that make up an extraordinary life. And in the morning, when Daniel woke up next to the woman who'd become his wife and his partner in everything that mattered, he would remember the night when a desperate father's love had collided with a powerful woman's courage, creating something neither of them could have achieved alone. The janitor and the CEO had become simply Daniel and Victoria Hayes' parents to a little girl who'd taught them both that the best families aren't born, they're forged in the fires of adversity and tempered by the choice to keep fighting for each other no matter what the world throws at them.